Welcome to another episode of A Dose of Science. And today it's kind of a frustrating dose because we are constantly frustrated by the amount of pseudoscience that is out there, the amount of misinformation and the amount of disinformation. And the world, of course, has been turned upside down by COVID, but this kind of has been a godsend for the promoters of pseudoscience, and there are a lot of them out there. And the anti-vaxxers are very effective in their campaigns, and unfortunately, vaccination rates have slowed down, which can have catastrophic consequences. I just came across an article right now, people in the US, anti-vaxxers, refusing blood transfusions if the blood came from vaccinated people. Can you guys believe that? I bet you can, yeah. And they're worried that somehow whatever is in the blood of the vaccinated people is going to be transferred to them. It's going to rearrange their DNA or maybe magnetize their body, make them infertile. All of these claims have been made. Of course, the truth is that the vaccine is injected into the deltoid muscle in the arm. The vaccine itself does not circulate in the bloodstream. The only thing that circulates in the bloodstream are the antibodies that are formed in response to the vaccine. So the worry makes absolutely no sense. And it's really hard to fathom how all of this happens, how people come to believe the unbelievable. But it has consequences because we see the vaccination rates slowing down. And of course, the anti-vaxxers constantly refer to a US website where vaccine side effects are listed, the VAERS website, which Jonathan has written about and I think wants to comment on again.
Yeah, so I want to talk about not VAERS itself, but a website called OpenVAERS. So hopefully you can see my screen right now. So yeah, speaking of misinformation, speaking of how people can start to believe all kinds of things about the vaccine, there are activists out there who are spreading misinformation. And so this is one of those places. This is called OpenVAERS. VAERS is an actual government-run website in the United States. It stands for Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. It's a very useful database where anybody can sort of submit a report of something that happened to them after they received a vaccine, not necessarily a COVID vaccine. Now there's a new website called OpenVAERS, and I wanted to show the main page of OpenVAERS to point out a few things. So this is what the main page on OpenVAERS looks like. And if we look on the left, what I underline in yellow here, so it will say that this is VAERS itself is a voluntary reporting system that has been estimated to account for only 1% of vaccine injuries. So right there, we're being told, the numbers you're about to see, it's just a tip of the iceberg. It's so much worse than that. There is at the bottom of this column a little box here that I'm pointing to with the yellow arrow. It says, if you want to read the VAERS disclaimer, you have to click here. Now, as you can see, this button is barely visible. It's light gray. The writing is white over light gray. So it's very hard to see. You don't see the disclaimer when you're on the website unless you go searching for it. Then there's this big scary number, 1,357,036. So these are reports of vaccine adverse events in VAERS. Now, these are not all for COVID. These for all vaccines. But of course, because we're in the middle of this pandemic, you look at this number, you make the association, you think about COVID. 12,000 reported deaths after the COVID vaccine. So very, very scary stuff. I was mentioning this disclaimer. And if we do a little split screen here, so on the left, if you find this website called OpenVAERS, which is not run by the US government, and we'll get to who is behind this, you really have to go searching for this disclaimer. But when you are going on the actual VAERS website that is run by the US government, there is a big box here. And this is a very important disclaimer that you have to read, and you have to check a little box before you're even allowed to look at the data. And what the disclaimer says is, hey, by the way, what you're about to see, right? This is a database where anybody can report anything following the vaccine. When I wrote about this I went through some of the reports that have been made for the COVID vaccine, and somebody wrote that their penis had swelled to 10 times its size after receiving the COVID vaccine, right? So this just give you an idea that anything.
Wait. I thought it was an adverse event reporting system.
I know, right? So, well, if it's 10 times the original size, it might make things very, very hard on you. No pun intended. So the disclaimer goes on to say that the number of reports alone, the fact you have 1.3 million reports, for example, does not indicate in any way. You cannot draw any strong conclusions from that because you don't have the denominator. These reports are not verified, so they really have to be interpreted in the context of scientific information, right? So the actual website, you have to read this before you access the data. OpenVAERS, you don't have to do that. They're just feeding you the numbers right away. And if you go on OpenVAERS, you can see a graph like this. It is very, very scary, right? COVID vaccine data, deaths reported to VAERS by year, boom, big spike starting in 2020. Oh my God, people are dying left and right because of the COVID vaccine, right? This is what you're made to think. And if you go again on this website, you ask, well, who is behind OpenVAERS? Well, you're told it's a small team of people with vaccine injuries or who have children with vaccine injuries, and they're not in it for the money. They just wanted to help other people browse the VAERS records. And when you read the investigation that was done that I'm about to get to, when the person behind the website was asked, why do you do this? The answer is, oh, well, the original website by the government is very hard to access. It's hard to go through it. So we wanted to get a better interface going so that people can more easily find the information that they're looking for. So there was an investigation by the website Logically in partnership with Vice, and they found out who was behind this website. And I particularly like the Vice News headline, this woman secretly runs one of the world's biggest anti-vax websites from her house, right? This is the situation that we're in right now with the internet, with social media, is that anybody can start one of the biggest anti-vax websites from their house and reach so many people. And so this is the person who is behind OpenVAERS. Her name is Elizabeth Pearl Wilner. She's 55. She lives in a very wealthy enclave of California. And just for comparison, the VAERS website in the last 6 months got about 800,000 visitors. Her website, OpenVAERS, got 1.23 million visitors in that same span of time. So it's a very popular website, more so than VAERS itself. And what Vice News discovered is that 30% of the visitors to OpenVAERS actually come from a single website called Gateway Pundit, which is a right-wing conspiracy site. If you go to Gateway Pundit, you can buy their merch. You can buy a T-shirt that says "Don't Believe the Big Lie" with Joe Biden's face on it. There's the T-shirt reminding people that the election was stolen. And there's a website that says "Fauci lied, many died." What I love about it is that it seems to imply that somebody has flatline and then they come back to life. Whereas what I think they wanted to do is have the heartbeat and then the flatline. But, we shouldn't expect a basic knowledge of medicine.
Also, the word stolen seems to be very curiously placed on a particular part of her anatomy.
Yes, I don't think that was done on purpose. But there you go. So almost a third of the traffic to OpenVAERS comes from this right-wing conspiracy website called Gateway Pundit. But if you don't know Gateway Pundit and you're on social media, you might have seen those kinds of posts. And these are some posts that have been made that are using these numbers from OpenVAERS. And again, they look very, very scary. And so if you're on the fence about the COVID vaccines and you're on Instagram or you're on Facebook and you see these things go by every day, that can have an impact on whether or not you're going to want the vaccine or not. This is the woman behind OpenVAERS. She posted this in as a reply to the fact that New York City will now require proof of vaccination for indoor dining and fitness. If you participate in this, you are no better than the Germans who just went along. So she is part of now a long line of anti-vaxxers who are comparing themselves essentially to Jews during the Holocaust. This is Del Bigtree, one of the biggest voices in the anti-vax movement, wearing the yellow Star of David. So that's absolutely just despicable stuff. So I wrote about all of this. If anybody's interested in this particular thing, so it used to be that people would just grab statistics from the VAERS database and convince people that those numbers had been verified and meant what it was that they seemed to mean, that the vaccine was causing injuries left and right and causing deaths left and right. That is not the case. But now there is a website that is actually sort of mirroring VAERS, but without the disclaimer that you cannot take this data at face value. You have to know what you're doing. And that's why they have experts that are looking at the VAERS reports and they're trying to see, okay, is there something that is trending here? Is there a particular syndrome, as we saw with AstraZeneca and the very rare risk of a blood clot? Is there a specific syndrome that is being reported that we should look into? So VAERS is very important. OpenVAERS, not so much. So there you go.
Yeah, it just goes to show again that very often pseudoscience can trump science because they're so good at mystifying people just by throwing the data at them. And unless someone digs into it, like you always do, they will not be able to unravel, the truth behind it. And then on face value, it all looks very compelling.
And then it's a very definition of pseudoscience, right? It's fake science. It looks scientific, right? You go there, you say, oh, this is data from the government. These are the numbers. These are all the reports. So it looks like science, but if you don't know the details behind this, you're going to fall for this. And it's quite scary.
Yeah, it gives out a lot of false heat, which brings us to Ada.
First, I have two questions for Jonathan on the VAERS. Isn't this illegal? Like, is this not misrepresenting health data? Like, somehow this feels like it should be illegal.
Yeah, as you know, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know. That's a very good question. I don't know the legality of something like that. If VAERS is sort of open access, then it's quite possible that it's not illegal, that anybody can take and repackage this data. But at the very least, it is unethical.
Yeah, okay. And my other question was, so in principle, the VAERS system is supposed to help us identify these rare conditions that maybe aren't seen in clinical trials, aren't seen when drugs are first approved. Has that ever actually happened? Like, is there actually any proof that VAERS has helped us identify such things? Because there was the blood clot syndrome, but that I thought that data didn't come through VAERS. It came rather from more diffuse sources.
Yeah, so if I remember correctly, RotaShield, which was a vaccine against the rotavirus that was given to infants, there was a rare event with, I think it's called intussusception. It's when the colon sort of collapses in on itself, a bit like an accordion. And I do believe that this was first spotted through VAERS, and then the manufacturer removed RotaShield from the market. So it has helped in the past, and it's good to have. But the problem is, it's a problem of transparency, right? So you want to be if you're the government, you want to be transparent because it inspires confidence. But at the same time, this kind of transparency can backfire when people go in and they take things out of context. They don't understand that experts have to analyze this data before you can act on it, and so it's a double-edged sword.
Okay, Ada, let's have your hot topic.
Yeah, so I want to talk about hot dogs, but not that kind, because as you guys know, I'm a vegetarian. So what I actually want to talk about, if I can just share my screen quickly here, is hyperthermia, not hypothermia, which if you try to Google hyperthermia, you will mostly find results for hypothermia. Hypo is the absence of heat. Hyper is too much heat. So we are talking about overheating. So sunstroke, heat stroke, kind of generally summarized under the moniker of heat-related illness. And specifically, I want to talk about the way that we define different stages of it. Because so traditionally, and I don't know about you guys, but I've throughout my life very much just kind of used these terms casually. Like if somebody's not feeling great after spending a day in the sun, I'd be like, oh, you must have heat stroke, you have sunstroke. Like, take care of yourself. But it's not something that I've ever actually seen diagnosed with doctors. It turns out that there are three categories of heat-related illnesses. So it starts with heat stress, which is when the heat has just started to stress your body. So you're starting to have mild uncomfortableness. Moves on to heat exhaustion, obviously more severe than stress. And finally, heat stroke. But the thing is that these symptoms are very not well defined. They're very subjective. They're very, well, do you feel uncomfortable? Are you dizzy? Well, how dizzy? There's not like a standard, this is when it moves from heat stress to heat exhaustion. And so in 2015, there was a new model proposed, and it recognizes that this is a progressive disease. So as opposed to having these kind of concrete, like at this point, you move from stage 1 to stage 2. In this sense, you recognize that there's a lot of overlap between symptoms and a lot of overlap between stages. But more importantly, this is part of an effort to redefine the symptoms and such that are associated with a clinical diagnosis. So this has big implications for hot dogs, which is what I want to talk about, but it also has big implications for a lot of different audiences. So if you have things like perceived discomfort, physiologic strain, dizziness, weakness, those are all things that if someone can't talk to you, they can't really tell you that. Someone can't tell you how dizzy they're feeling or how uncomfortable or tired they're feeling if there's a language barrier, if they're disabled, if they're deaf, if they're a dog, and if they're children in a lot of cases. And so a lot of the time for children and for animals, we rely on their parents or their owners to kind of measure and estimate these things for us. But with this newer model, the hope is that by moving to more concrete diagnostic things like, are they vomiting? We're able to better define it and therefore better treat it. And as you can see by this list of various heat illnesses in humans, it's really confusing and overlapping, and we do not have good concrete criteria. There's so many different heat-related illnesses, and it's really not clear which are more severe and which we should be scared about. And so by using this model, we potentially can hopefully instill in people how serious heat-related illnesses can be. And a big reason I was inspired to talk about this week is it's been so hot here. It's been just horrible, like above 30 so many days. I don't have air conditioning. I don't know about you guys, but it's fairly common not to have air conditioning in Montreal. And we see deaths every single year from heat-related illnesses. And it's not something
with global warming, it's not going to improve.
Exactly. It's only getting much worse. And it's not something that people tend to take very seriously. We know we can die of hypothermia. We've all heard about people dying in the Himalayas or stranded in their cars, but getting too hot doesn't seem as much of an issue to a lot of our brains, and human brains aren't usually great at understanding risk anyways. So hopefully this is one way to help us understand it a bit better. But specifically to just quickly talk about it in dogs, because our furry friends have a lot of fur, and a lot of fur means a lot of heat. And particularly because your kid or your friend or your husband, they can tell you when they start to feel crappy, or at most you are more trained to observe the signs of your kid feeling crappy. But when animals start feeling crappy, they can't just be like, hey, I don't feel good. And the signs are often much more subtle. So there are things like panting excessively, collapsing, obviously, lethargy, gastrointestinal disturbance. So it seems strange, but anorexia, not wanting to eat, or vomiting can be signs of heat stroke in dogs. And so there's a new study that was done fairly recently in 2020 that looked, massive study, looked at veterinary data in, sure, the lights are off now, in 2020 in the UK. The incidence rate ends up being about 0.15%. So that's not much, but when it happens to certain breeds very much. So the odds ratios compared to Labradors, which are kind of seen as the default dog, in studies, they're the
default model.
Yeah, they're not at an elevated risk for heat illness. They're not at a decreased risk. They're just kind of hanging out. Compared to them, there are certain risk factors with something like a Chow Chow, which has an odds ratio of 16 times higher than a Labrador for heat-related illness. They are super puffy. They're super puffy and hairy and thick coats. And I believe they originated in cold weather climates. Dogs like bulldogs, which are exceptionally popular in the UK, and French bulldogs, they suffer, as well as pugs, from some different anatomical reasons why they're at such huge risks. But even a golden retriever, which is seen as kind of like a standard healthy family dog, is at a fairly increased risk. And so There are also other risk factors, including a high BMI, although it's not really clear whether having a heavy dog is the problem or having an obese dog is the problem. Big dogs, a big mastiff might weigh as much as a very fat Cocker Spaniel, but the mastiff may not be at the same level of risk. And that's largely because we don't do like body fat measurements in dogs, not very often. So when looking at this retrospective data, we can't really tell the difference between dogs that are big versus dogs that are obese. And another big one is brachycephalic dogs. So if you're not familiar with what that means, these skulls shown in the middle, which belong to Chihuahuas, French Bulldogs, and Pugs, are called brachycephalic. And it basically means that their nose and their snout is really pushed in. They've got that squished face. They kind of look like they ran face first into like a pane of glass. And they are at exceptionally higher risk. Not exceptionally. It's not the same as the Chow Chow, but I say exceptionally because it's so common. Brachycephalic dogs are some of the most popular breeds, particularly in the UK. And these dogs just basically can't breathe right because through selective breathing, we've messed up their anatomy. And so the dogs in the middle are the brachycephalic dogs. The dogs up top are some examples of the opposite. So instead of having a squished in nose, you have a lengthened out nose, like a collie. And that doesn't seem to be associated with the same problems. But this is just in general a good example of how drastically humans have altered dog skull shape. And even though the odds, the incident rate is not that big, less than 2%, the fatalities are pretty big. 14% of all dogs that were affected by heat-related illnesses died. That isn't nothing. And so this is, if you're interested in learning any more about this, this is a BS AVA talk by Emily Hall. It's on YouTube. I've just made a short link to make it a bit easier. And it really talks about how these changes in how we talk about heat illness with dogs are going to have big implications on how we talk about heat illness in humans, particularly in pediatric wards and with disabled people. But as well, I wanted to talk about this because I think it points out a really interesting issue in science, particularly in veterinary science, where people kind of just are like, wait, why are they doing the study? Like, what did we learn from this? We learned that dogs get heat stroke, yay. But we need numbers like this. We need data. We need statistics in order to look into further treatments, in order to properly prioritize research money. These kinds of like basic studies just to find out what the field looks like are really, really important. So even if you look at a study and you're like, why did they do this? There's probably a reason, because grant money is fairly competitive.
So what you're saying is that if you have a dog and it's very hot outside, you should feed it ice cream every day. You
should feed it frozen water and call it ice cream.
It's certainly not chocolate ice cream.
Certainly not chocolate ice cream, no. Although you can, a lot of dogs really like watermelon, and frozen watermelon can be really good for them. And you can also just take like wet dog foods, water them down a bit and make them popsicles.
All right, we're going to switch from dogs to chickens. What is that all about?
Media.
And of course, that's what we are involved with because we work in all of these areas. And of course, people are also puzzled, confused about many of the things that are said in the media. For example, about chickens, I want to tell you a quick little story here. It's an interesting one because of an article that I wrote about chicken McNuggets, which got a tremendous amount of attention. I focused in on some comments made by, first of all, Ruth Winter, who really has no understanding of science based on everything that she writes in this book about food additives. And I just want to pick on one particular one, tertiary butyl hydroxyquinone, which is a substance that is added to fat, usually in very, very small amounts, in order to prevent the fat from bubbling over. So when you're frying, you don't want the big bubbling. And this indeed will prevent that. Now, let me just show you what I mean by having total ignorance about science, because what she says about TBHQ is that it is a form of butane or lighter fluid. This is, of course, total nonsense. It is not a form of butane at all. It just so happens to have a 4-carbon fragment in the molecule, and that is referred to as a butyl fragment. There's nothing to do with butane lighter fluid.
Is she
Now,
related to the food babe?
Yes, very similar. And TBHQ, like any other chemical, of course, in high dose can potentially cause problems, as you can see, nausea, vomiting, all of that. That is true. But you would have to eat a tremendous amount of chicken McNuggets in order to have this effect. Because when we do the analysis of chicken McNuggets to find out how much TBHQ there is, it's a minimal amount. The maximum that is allowed in oil is about 0.02%. That is 0.02%. So that a maximally preserved batch of nuggets would require eating 313 nuggets. Now, I think even the people who are totally addicted to chicken McNuggets would have a tough job downing 313 of these pieces.
But the guy who did the movie Super Size Me, maybe that's what he did. I don't know.
Yes, and just this is one of those nonsensical scares. And yeah, I mean, it's true that the chemical is there in the chicken McNuggets, but it really is not relevant. Also, you'll find in chicken McNuggets dimethyl polysiloxane. Mm-hmm. And that, according to our pal, Joe Mercola, who has been branded as the #1 misinformant on the web. This, of course, is not something that should ever be consumed. This also makes it easier to fry with this oil. Again, it prevents it from boiling over. And his main complaint here is that this is the same material out of which silly putty is made. And would you want to be eating silly putty? Well, I think we would all agree that no, we don't want to feed our kids silly putty, even though I think it would be perfectly fine to eat, because after all, dimethyl polysiloxane is the active ingredient in Mylanta, because it reduces gaseous emissions in the human body. But just because a substance is used in one context doesn't mean it cannot be used safely in another context. After all, we don't mind drinking water, even though it's a basic ingredient of cement. So those kind of arguments are just silly. But anyway, I described all of this in the article, and I went on to say that the real problem in chicken McNuggets is not that the ingredients have unpronounceable names or that they can be used to make silly putty. The real problem here is that most of the calories come from fat. So that was the conclusion of the article. And I don't think not gotten as much hate mail about any article that I've written as about that one. And what is interesting is that it came from both sides. There were those, of course, who accused me of being a shill for McDonald's, for trying to downplay the lethal nature of chicken McNuggets. And then there was the McNugget community who attacked me for presenting the McNuggets as being more dangerous than they really are. The reason that I find this story so interesting, because it just goes to show you a concept that we deal with all the time, is don't let the facts get in the way of an argument, right? And the minds were made up here on both sides. Those who love the chicken McNuggets don't want to hear anything about how there might be an issue with them. And the anti-chicken McNugget people, of course, should you ever say that these are not murderous things, they will jump down your throat. So I thought, that's sort of an interesting story because, I mean, I got such venomous emails about this, many of them questioned the marital status of my parents. They questioned my body composition and suggested that it was mostly of a variety that normally exits the body. And the vile nature of the comments was just staggering. And I would have never expected that from chicken McNuggets.
The comments on the McNuggets were more vile than the McNuggets themselves, is what you're saying.
Yes, yes.
Well, we expect comments like this on like our vaccine articles because the anti-vaccine crowd are very vocal. But it's always somewhere out of nowhere. I think of all the articles I've written, the one that's gotten the most hate was one that just looked at whether or not putting a bell on a cat's collar helps reduce the predation rate of outdoor cats. Right. I didn't say you should put your cat outside. I didn't say that was okay or not okay. All I said is if you put a bell on it, does it count?
The Berlin Wall also, right?
Yep. And a lot of like little funny ones that you guys write, because I manage the Facebook, just continually get comments, even though they're years old and about nothing controversial.
Right, and of course we got some very disturbing ones as well. It's just as the one that you sent me the other day, saying that the Nobel Prizes are given out unjustly because there's a very high percentage of Jews who receive it.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, this is the kind of nonsense that one doesn't even want to comment on because we know where it's coming from. You know what the message really is. Yeah. All right, so that's it. We have run out of time. We've covered a lot of ground here, from bears to dogs to chickens, and hopefully made sense out of a lot of the nonsense that is out there.
Oh, wait, don't forget my animal fact.
Your animal fact, let's go.
So hyenas, those lovely
cackling hyenas
that live in Africa. They look pretty much like dogs, right? But fun fact, they're actually more closely related to cats. They're actually in the feline family rather than the canine.
No way.
Thank you for your enthusiasm, Jonathan.
We don't have an audience. We don't have a live audience, so I have to.
How did we ever go through life not knowing this?
I know, right? What are you gonna? Did you know they give birth through their clitoris?
Oh, ouch! How? I don't.
Painfully.
Yes, it's painful. Let's leave it at that. Painfully.
Yes, that's a neat little fact to tuck away for discussion sometime. All right. Thanks, everyone, for listening. We'll be back with you in 2 weeks' time. And by then, I suspect a lot more pseudoscience will have piled up that we can trample on. So, bye, everyone.
Bye.
Yeah.